Welcome back. Last time I talked about the 2017 presidential election, which really was an interesting election in that a brand new political party won the presidency. Mr. Macron had broken away from the Socialist Party. He was a socialist cabinet official. He was very unhappy with Mr. Hollande. He wanted to move the party to the center. We saw that parallel, remember, in Britain when unhappy Laborites who believed their party was too far to the left broke away and formed the Social Democratic Party. So certainly you see a parallel in the case of Macron. The big difference, of course, is that in France there is tremendous volatility in parties. They frequently change names. Voters are not nearly as loyal to their political parties as people in both Britain uh, and in the United States. And so as a result, we saw this victory by Mr. Macron. I decided to look up some demographics. I've done this before, and looking at who supported who in the 2017 election. And to me, there were some interesting things. I don't think that they were shocking or earth-shattering, but I think they were kind of intriguing. For example, when it came to gender, women voted for Macron 68 to 32. Men voted for Macron 62 to 38. The group most likely to favor Mr. Macron were professionals. 82% of professionals voted for Mr. Macron. The more educated the voter, the more likely they were to vote for Mr. Macron. And the higher the income level of the voter, the more likely they were to vote for Mr. Macron. On the other hand, if you look at the appeal for the National Front, the fascist party, for Marine Le Pen, the people who were most likely to support Marine Le Pen were blue-collar workers. 56% to 44% blue-collar workers voted for the National Front and Marine Le Pen. The less education the voter had, the more likely they were to vote for Le Pen. The less income the voter had, the more likely they were to vote for Le Pen. And so as I was collecting these demographics, I was thinking back to the 2016 election. You may remember when Donald Trump in one of his campaign stops said that I love the uneducated because the less education the voter had, the more likely they were to vote for Mr. Trump. And so the same thing was true in the last French presidential election. The less educated the voter, the more likely they were to vote for the more authoritarian political candidate. Now, even though your book points out several things in the small section on parties, I will let you read a lot of that for yourself, but I do want to highlight a few things about political parties in France that are very, very different than in either Britain or the United States. In both Britain and the United States, the parties are very independent from one another and very competitive with one another. Yes, there have been two occasions in Britain where coalitions were formed for expediency, but the parties really did not support one another during the election, and in fact were forced into kind of a coalition just out of circumstance. In France, that two rounds of elections really does reinforce those electoral alliances. But your book points out, in my opinion, correctly, the two political blocs are very divided. For example, if you look at the two major parties of the left, the communists and the socialists, they have been bitter enemies for decades. At first, the communists were the leading party of the left, and then Mitterrand was incredible strategist, and he was able to make the Socialists a major party of the left, and that has been true with really no exception other than the 2000 election ever since. Uh, when you think about the left, I would want to point out something that Roskin does not talk about, and that is that people often assume that the left is monolithic, and throughout Europe there is a exception, and this is true in many countries throughout Europe. This is true in Germany. This is true in France. To a lesser extent, this is true in Italy, and that is there is a real significant and very deep division between green parties, those that stress environmentalism, versus socialists and communists who have traditionally stressed material gains, things like higher wages, higher standards of living, the redistribution of income. So traditional leftist parties like the socialists and the communists are more focused on redistribution of resources and unemployment, whereas Greens are interested in what I would call milieu goals, environmental goals, and in many cases, things that they advocate, like huge taxes on gasoline to encourage mass transit, for example, often hurt working people the most. So don't assume that the parties of the left are united, because certainly throughout Europe they're very divided. But in France, because of these two rounds, the socialists and the communists do tend to support one another on the second ballot in both legislative elections and in presidential elections. One thing that all the parties agree on is that the National Front is not a legitimate partner. You notice that twice the National Front has made the runoff election, and in both cases the other parties overwhelmingly urge their voters to vote against the National Front. So there is something that the mainstream parties of both the left and the right agree on, and that is that the National Front is not a legitimate partner. We're not going to play ball with them at all. The conservative parties have less policy differences, although I would say that the Gaullists are more traditional. The neo-Gaullists are what became Republicans, were usually a little bit more socially liberal. The Gaullists also very skeptical of the European Union, and the more centrist parties tend to be more pro-EU, and centrist parties tend to be more accommodating of the free market, and certainly Mr. Macron is the poster child for centrism. Very pro Europe, and very pro free market in wanting to reform the system. The social class box that's in Roskin makes a lot of sense, but I want to add to it a little bit. Certainly it is true that if you look at parties of the left, they tend to draw from the working class. They tend to be anti-clerical, anti-religious, and urban. And right-wing parties tend to be more middle class, much more pro-church, pro-Catholic, and rural. And certainly a few things that I would note. When we were talking about Britain, certainly the blue-collar workers supporting labor, and white-collar workers supporting conservatives. You see that same working class, middle class dynamic in both Britain and in France, and I think to a degree in the United States. Certainly in urban areas supporting parties of the left, this is true in the United States, this is true in Britain, and it is true in France. But the biggest difference between France and Britain is the strongest predictor of voting behavior in France. The very strongest is degree of religious conviction. The more often the voter goes to Mass, the more likely they are to vote conservative, and this has been true for a considerable period of time. One other thing where I have a profound, I wouldn't say disagreement with Roskin, but I think Roskin only tells you part of the story, is that Roskin talks about how the voters in democratic societies in Europe, whether it is Britain, whether it is France, whether it is Germany, that they are all moderate voters. That's fine as far as it goes, but I think Roskin, to be fair, should point out that British voters are right-leaning. If you look at that 9-point political continuum that's in your book for both Britain and France, in Britain, 17% of the voters were liberal, 57% moderate, 28% conservative. That is a right-leaning electorate. If you look at the same diagram for France, you see something completely different. 27% liberal, 54% moderate, and 19% conservative. And so I see a significant difference. I would repeat the claim that I made in class that the French are left-leaning and the British or are right-leaning in this case. And even though we in America think of socialists as being tremendous leftists, in fact, critics of the Democratic Party in America try to claim that they're socialists. Socialists talk like they're leftists, but what we have seen in the case of both Mr. Mitterrand as well as Mr. Hollande is that they actually governed towards the center. Now, one last thing that I would point to in terms of just amending something that Roskin said. Roskin claimed that he believed that France was headed towards a two-plus party system because essentially his argument was for expediency. What we really have in France is a collection of two blocks. And you see those little pyramids in your book, right, with the communists on the far left and then the socialists to the right of them. And then on the other side, you have the Republicans, the Gaullists, and on the far right, the National Front. That makes the assumption that these parties are kind of monolithic, that they're not changeable. And of course, in my mind, the volatility of political parties is so great that those parties are unstable. And so, for example, that diagram does not point out the fact that new parties do come, new parties do go, that you had Giscard d'Estaing bring in the Giscardians. And certainly, if you take a look at Mr. Macron has created a brand new political party that isn't even on that spectrum and would be clearly in the center. And so the last thing that I would point out from the start of my notes is just a summary of what I pointed out before, and that is Macron is really a remarkable politician because if you look up until 2017, no French political party really ever ran on a true free market economic platform. The notion of statism was alive for both parties of the left and the right. And Macron took a chance, said, we understand that there are significant economic problems. We believe that we need to modify statism, not to eliminate it. Certainly it's going to continue, but we need to reform the system. We don't need to replace it. We don't need to radicalize it, but we need to change it. If you take a look in the last 30 seconds of this lecture, I just want to point out once again a study that I looked at from Converse and Depot that found that French children are not even aware of the general inclination of their father's political party. That in this particular case means and buys into that notion that I mentioned earlier. French political parties are very volatile, and so are voters' tendencies on election day.